Hey, welcome to session 3, Support Your Foundation. We've talked about the belt of truth and the body armor of righteousness. And in this session, we're going to go down to our feet. If you take a look at page 49, you'll see our passage for this session is Ephesians 6:15, where we talk about our shoes, our feet being prepared with the peace that comes from the gospel. In our Ephesus story, we've heard about this family in Ephesus, this fictional family, and we've heard about the father, the husband, who is a potter by trade, and his struggles of trying to understand this passage from Paul as if it was read to them in their small house church by their pastor and discussed and talked about amongst them as they gather together and they pray. In an Ephesus story, chapter 3, peace, we're going to be introduced to his wife. The streets of Ephesus never truly slept. From her doorway, she could hear it, the echo of sandals on marble, merchants shouting late deals, laughter spilling from taverns, arguments flaring and fading like sparks in the dark. Chaos had a rhythm here, and for most of her life, she had learned to walk in step with that rhythm. Avoid conflict. Keep your head down. Move quickly when the ground feels unstable. But lately, even familiar streets felt uneven. Tension followed her everywhere. At home, the weight of unspoken fears pressed into the corners of each room. At the market, strained smiles masked quiet judgment. At the temple steps, she felt the pull of old habits, places her feet had gone 1,000 times before, and now forbidden by conviction and costly in consequence. She was tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the deep weariness of always bracing for impact. One afternoon, a disagreement erupted between two merchants near her stall, voices sharp, tempers flaring. Instinct told her to step away, to disappear into the crowd. But instead, she paused. She breathed. She remembered the words read aloud days earlier. For shoes, put on the peace that comes from the good news so that you will be fully prepared. Shoes, not armor for attack, footing for the journey. Peace, she was learning, was not the absence of conflict, it was stability within. The good news of Jesus didn't remove the chaos of Ephesus, but it gave her something solid beneath her feet, a place to stand without sliding into fear or anger, a way to move through tension without carrying it home. That evening, her husband returned unsettled by threats whispered at his workshop. She listened without fixing, without escalating. Her calm steadied him more than words could. Peace traveled through her steps and settled into their home. As night fell, she realized something quietly profound. Wherever her feet carried her now, market, household, hostile streets, she had a choice: to spread unrest or to bring peace, to react or to remain rooted. And for the first time in a long while, the ground beneath her feet felt firm enough to stand and gentle enough to walk forward in faith. In this session, we're going to take a look at Ephesians chapter 6, verse 15, where we see, for shoes, put on the peace that comes from the good news so that you will be fully prepared. In some translations, it talks about the preparation of the gospel of peace. As I mentioned in our introductory video, in this session, what we're looking at is not a peace that necessarily is proselytizing and evangelizing and proclaiming and preaching from the housetops or preaching from the street corners. And while that may be a part of this idea, what we find Paul leaning into even more so is the peace that the gospel message proclaims is that we have peace with God, and because we can have peace with God, we then can have peace with each other and peace within ourselves and to be finally at rest. Have you ever noticed sometimes in our relationships and in people that we meet in life that if they have unrest within, if they have unrest and they are restless and in conflict and in tension themselves with whether it's a past trauma or something that they want that they can't have or a conflict that they have with someone else, it'll surface not just in their private life, but it'll surface in other lives as well. Hebrews talks about that a root of bitterness, of this internal contention that'll spring up, and it just doesn't stay with one person. It doesn't stay hidden, that it has the potential to impact many people. What we see is that it happens in our homes so easily. If a parent, if a father, for instance, is upset or not at peace, that his temperament and his attitude and his spirit can really dictate the temperament of the home. That if a boss is in tension or is in conflict, that it really can impact the nature and the tension that's felt in the workplace. If a pastor, for me, being in tension, if I have internal conflict or I'm at odds with others, that it can profoundly impact our church, our ministry, in our communities, and in our neighborhoods. People that live in private contention will ultimately have public conflict all around them. And so, if you can see conflicts happening, you can know it's always tied to an internal tension or an internal trauma, an internal bitterness, an internal conflict of someone not being at peace, not being at peace with themselves, not being at peace with God. As we find this, we see this unhurried strength to support your foundation. The struggle is life feels unstable. Chaos, conflict, constant demands can leave believers, followers of Jesus, off balance. It can leave us exhausted and reactive rather than steady. And so that leads us then to this question: where can I find firm footing when the world feels unstable around me? The big idea then that we'll unpack is this: that the gospel, that is, that Jesus died for us so that we could have a relationship with God and be reconciled to God, to be forgiven. The gospel of peace gives believers stability, readiness, and courage in every battle. What we find that's truly amazing is he says that you don't put on your footwear when you're already in the midst of the conflict, that you put on your footwear before you go into a conflict. Why? So that you can be fully prepared for what you're about to face. We'll unpack this more and more, but some of the history behind the footwear of the Roman soldiers was pretty profound. They had these metal studs, almost like a cleat that an athlete would wear on their track spikes. That they had these studs that were fastened to the bottom of these their leather sandals, so that they could give them firm footing so they wouldn't slip. If you lost your footing, their gear and their sword and their shield and their pack that they would wear as they marched, if they lost their footing, and it was roughly about the same weight of what soldiers would take into battle today. A rucksack would be anywhere from 50 to 60 to even 70 pounds. And so all that they would need, all their gear, if they lost their footing, that weight is taking them down. They're not going to be able to slip and slide and kind of hold their ground. To support their foundation, they're going to have good footwear. What we find then is this: how does peace impact us? How does peace give us a firm foundation and support what's underneath us? We'll find this. Number one is that God's peace gives us stability. God's peace gives us stability. In Ephesians chapter 2, again, these truths that Paul unpacks for us in Ephesians 6. And by the way, this is just a quick side note, that the armor of God, the reason why he doesn't elaborate on this, it's really like a table of contents, if you will, or an index. It's like the drop down menu on your computer, or it's like the tabs at the top of a website, the home, about us, all the different things that we can find. The armor is really an unpacking of all the concepts he's already talked about in the last 5 chapters. And so we looked at Ephesians chapter 2 to understand this, that God's peace stabilizes us, gives us stability. Ephesians 2:14 to 16, take a look there. For Christ himself has brought peace to us. How? That he united the Jews and the Gentiles into one people when his own body, in his own body on the cross. That is, that he didn't just die for Jews, he didn't just die for Gentiles, but he died for all humanity. He broke down the wall of hostility, and through the cross, God reconciled both groups to himself in one body. What Paul is talking about here of this wall of hostility, the temple in Jerusalem was not just a place of worship, but in many respects it was the most prized real estate back in those days in the Mediterranean area of the Middle East. And even today, there's massive conflict over the land there in Israel as well. What was so interesting about the temple was that temples back in those days, even the temple of Artemis and the temple in Jerusalem that was destroyed in 70 AD, just a few years after this letter was written to the Ephesians, that temple many times were functional banks because it was a place where people brought money to buy their sacrifices, to get in good with the gods, or to get in good with God, Jehovah, for the Jews. They would bring their money there, and it was a protected place. It was a very public place. So instead of keeping your money in private at home, stuck under your mattress, if you will, not that they had mattresses necessarily, but you would take it to the temple and they would hold your money there for you as a functional bank, if you will. So there's a lot of money coming and going from this place. And whoever controlled the temple, they controlled the purse strings, they controlled the money, they controlled the cash flow in the economy, if you will. So it'd be like owning real estate in Wall Street in New York City. So whoever owns that, it's prime real estate. And so what's interesting is this: there were different courts, different levels as far as how close people could get to God. And so in the far, far outer court was called the court of the Gentiles. The people who were not Jewish could only get so far, they could only get so close. And my first question is, well, why would a Gentile want to get close? Well, if you want to get a bank account and you aren't allowed to go into the bank, you're going to be pretty hard pressed to be able to go banking at this bank institution. In our society and culture, it's this idea of exclusion, of excluding people out of things, of you're not invited. It's the fear of missing out. It's the fear of being rejected. So the Gentiles could only come so far. This was an Old Testament law and practice that God had set in place in how he worked with the Jews and interacted with them in the Old Testament, how they set up the temple. The next court then was the court of the women. The women were allowed to come this far. Both men and women who were Jewish could come into the court of the women. That's where Jesus preached his message: I am the light of the world, with 70 to 75 foot tall candelabras, these lampstands that shined light all throughout Jerusalem. So wherever that light shone, it reflected off of the gold of the temple, and it reflected and shone light. Different rabbis wrote about how it lit up the courtyards and the front yards of houses all over Jerusalem during the feast of the Festival of Lights. So there's the court of the women. But then there's the court of the men, who excluded both Gentiles then and women and just was for men. They could go in then and worship in this next area. And then from there is the court of the priests, where the priests were only allowed to go and they would make their sacrifices. So just any Jewish man couldn't come that far. And then from there was the temple itself that only a select few high priests could get into. And from there was the holy place. And then there was the Holy of Holies that only once a year could the high priest then go and pour blood on the Ark of the Covenant, that famous piece of furniture. So again, there is just one boundary after another that people would have to jump over. When Jesus died, the gospel records that there was a veil between the holy place and the Holy of Holies, where God would sit, his throne, if you will. And it was torn in two. It was a miraculous act of God that tore the veil in two from top to bottom. And what was it symbolic of? That there was no longer this division between God and humans. There was no longer this division, that we could have access to God. We didn't have to go through these temple courts and have advocates for us and have priests to make sacrifices for us on our behalf about confessing to them. But it was that we now had access to God because of Christ's sacrifice. This is exactly what Paul's talking about, how this wall then that kept the Gentiles out as outsiders from being able to get to God, that Jesus broke that down. It's a long explanation for some incredible truths about what peace does for us. Peace is not the absence of conflict by any means. It's not escapism, it's not avoiding conflict, but it's the presence of God in conflict. It's it's what I tell sometimes when we talk about marriages and fighting. Fighting in marriage isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's healthy, but when you attack the problem but not the person. There's nothing wrong with having a discussion, but you need to know the difference between a discussion, a disagreement, an argument, and fighting. And this is totally side note. This is not your notes, but this is just for your own, for us, uh, just to tuck away. There is a discussion is simply it's just the weather outside. What is it like outside? Right now it's a little rainy, a little overcast, a little foggy today. That's just facts. I'm just sharing information, just discussing, talking about the weather, talking about sports. A disagreement is when somebody says, well, from my perspective, this is what I see, and we have differing opinions. Someone says, well, I don't like it when it's kind of rainy outside and overcast. That makes me depressed. Whereas somebody else might say, actually, it's a great time to make a nice cup of coffee and curl up with a good book in front of a fireplace and have your cat or your dog kind of sit in your lap with you. It's just a great time to kind of get cozy. I like this because everything kind of slows down. Now you have people who disagree with each other. What's challenging in our society, when we come to arguments, we think, well, arguments are bad. And actually, the truth is, an argument in and of itself is not a bad thing. An argument simply says, I am disagreeing with you, and here's then my list of reasons why. Discussion, it's an observation. A disagreement, I have a different observation than you, but I don't give my reasons why I have a different observation. Then an argument is this, here's my reasons why, to make an attempt to persuade you to see things from my perspective. The challenge, though, is what happens most often. What we see as arguments as a negative thing in our society are actually what I would call fights. There's nothing wrong with having a discussion, nothing wrong with having a disagreement. There's nothing wrong with even having an argument where you build your case, you make your case of why you see what you see, why you believe what you believe. Where we really fall apart is when we fight, when we begin to name call and make insults, or we as well begin to emotionally attack or attack somebody's character or attack them as a person and take away their dignity. In order for me to be morally right and to win my argument, I will go to not talking about the argument anymore. I will begin to attack you and to begin to dismantle your humanity and your integrity by saying things like blanket statements about your character, about your background, or about you, or what I assume about you, in order to discredit your position so I can win my position. I can win the argument. Paul's not calling us to that. He's not calling us to attack each other and to assassinate each other's character, if you will. What he's calling us to is this. He's saying, just as shoes support our steps physically, God's peace supports our choice, our steps, and our relationships in life. Every choice we make, how can I bring harmony and peace in my relationships? How can I bring peace into my school? How can I bring peace into my workplace? How can I bring peace into my marriage? How can I bring peace into raising my kids? How can I bring peace into my neighborhood? Instead of how can I force my way and get my way, it's how can I bring peace into this situation? We find not only does it give us stability, but peace enables readiness ahead of time in any given situation we walk into. Instead of having this thought of, man, how am I gonna manipulate and get my way, Paul makes this pitch for how can you bring peace into a situation that's already naturally going to conflict. You put two human beings in the same space, you're going to have problems. No matter how alike we are, no matter how much we have in common, when you put two human beings, when you put even one person, we have internal conflicts. Like I struggle with even like arguing with myself. Any of us do, right? But you put two human beings together for any length of time, they're gonna see things differently. Why we have marriage conflicts, and while we have all these different things in our lives where we have contracts so that we can't get out of agreements, and when we sign on the dotted line, Our word is no longer our bond. A handshake is no longer good enough. Why? Because we're going to change and renege all those things. We want to get out of contracts. Why is it so easy for subscription services nowadays that we can go ahead and say, hey, cancel anytime? Canceling your subscription is so easy because, like, yeah, we change and we want to get out of things, right? And so what we find here is this, is that peace enables us to be ready. Before I head into work today, I'm going to have a disagreement. There's going to be a disagreement. There's going to be a disappointment. Expectations aren't going to be met. How can I come in with peace in this conflict? Ephesians 6:15 talks about shoes giving us stability. The shoes that these soldiers would wear had studs on the bottom. If you lost your footing, you were taken out of the fight because you were dead. You're going to be dead weight. You would be removed from the battle. You couldn't walk and carry your part. What we're going to find here in a couple sessions, the shield wasn't just about protecting yourself. It was about protecting the soldier who fought to your right and the soldier who fought to your left, the soldier who fought behind you, the soldier who fought in front of you, and all around you. Because of some of the strategies of what the Roman army would do in going into battle, everybody had to be on guard. And if you lost your footing, if your sandal buckle snapped, if the leather deteriorated, if it wore out and you were done, you're out of the fight. Why? Because if you lost your footing, you're going to become a liability and not an asset. What was interesting as well about this is some Jewish communities, the sound of the studs on the sandals was almost like a psychological warfare technique. It was so deafening and so triggering for people that actually some Jewish communities outlawed people from wearing studded sandals in their community because it caused fear to well up in the hearts of people. It made them panic, if you will. Just like if you hear sirens wailing for local fire departments to go to a fire, or you hear sirens behind you for a police car, pulling you over, it causes cortisol to flood our system and adrenaline to pump. And so as soon as they would hear that clacking against marble path streets in their cities, it would cause them to be scared. But in this sense, for Paul, peace is practical. It keeps us alert, ready, able to respond. Philippians 4:6-7, it says, don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need. Thank Him for all He has done. And then, he says in verse 7, you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything we can understand. We live in a world that's all about comprehension, about understanding, about the nuances and the minutiae of facts and evidence and arguments and what's true and what's not true and all these things we've talked about. And he says there is a calmness in our lives that goes beyond explanation, a peace we can have from God. He says this peace will guard your hearts and your minds as you live in Christ Jesus. So again, you begin to see that as Paul does illustrate these different parts of the armor of God, they actually coincide with one another, that they complement each other. That peace, which is for stability for the ground, but also can give peace in your heart and in your mind, which the helmet protects your mind and the body armor protects your heart, and truth secures all those things. But it takes us then, as we look at our notes to the very next page, number 3, is this, that peace protects our heart. Ephesians 4, verses 1-3, peace that protects our heart. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. A bond. What is that? We have a bond between a brotherhood, if you will. We have a bond, we have a close connection. Peace is the adhesive, it's the glue, if you will. It's what mends our relationships when we begin to think, and we've talked about this before, even recently in our services, we talked about neural synchronicity, about being on the same page. It's when we have those relationships and those friendships where we're kind of weird, whether it's a friend that we grew up with, a friend from college, or a coworker, or just a friend that we have, or a spouse, or a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a partner, whatever it might be, where we finish each other's sentences and sandwiches, if you will, and it's kind of we're on the same page. Peace brings unity and helps us to get on the same page when I don't have to force my way, when I can let you be you. And even though I may not agree with what you're saying and you may not agree with what I'm saying, I can appeal, though, to the highest common denominator, which is what? That God calls us to live in peace with each other. Paul even says in Romans, he says, as much as you have the ability to do this, as much as you're able to, live in peace with everybody. He's not calling us to say, hey, go on vacation with each other. If you can't go on vacation with somebody, then you're falling short of God's standard of peace. But what he's calling us to is this bond that we will fight not with each other, but we'll fight for each other. Peace keeps us from being swept away by anger, by envy, by division, by selfishness. It anchors our emotions. It helps us respond with dignity and care. It helps us even when circumstances push us toward fear or frustration or assumptions. Assumptions kill peace. Assumptions wipe out peace. It literally wipes out our legs from under us. Because how many times have we thought, man, that person, they're thinking this, or I bet I know why they did that, or they said this, but what they really meant was, and we begin to assume things, and it literally, we undermine our footing. Why? Because we take away our peace. How many of us, I can raise my hand, we laid in bed with a sleepless night? Why? Because we were running all the scenarios of what somebody had said, and we wonder, what did they mean by that? What did they really mean? They didn't show up, or they showed up early, or they said this, and I think what they're trying to do. And we begin to assume things, and what does it do? It steals our peace. Worry floods our system, and we lose our peace. We find it not only protects our heart, but then we see number two, peace shapes our imagination. And it goes just hand in hand with what we just talked about. Peace shapes our imagination. We see here, he says in Ephesians 1:18-20, he says, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened. It's amazing. You see, does our heart have eyes? No. No more than potatoes have eyes, right? But he personifies, he uses a linguistic or a literary device where he personifies our heart to say that our heart might have eyes to see, to be perceptive, so that you may know the hope to which you have been called, the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints, and his incomparable great power for us who believe. Peace helps us to be able to trust that we can assume the best. 1 Corinthians 13 talks that love, it bears all things, it hopes all things, and endures all things, that love believes the best. And it talks about that faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. We see in Galatians chapter 5, verses 20-23, that one of the results, the outcomes of being a follower of Jesus is that the Holy Spirit works in our responses, no matter what the circumstances. And when we are walking in the Spirit, that is, how can I choose to be selfless and reflect God, being a good kid of God, reflect God, make God look good? When there's conflict, we respond instead of with meanness or harshness or argument, we respond with peace, to slow down, to calm down, to be at peace. And he says that your heart, that it will be enlightened so that you may know the hope that he has called you to. And what has he called us to? He's called us to a relationship with God. He's called us to heaven. He's called us to an eternity with him. He's called us to this peace. The gospel of peace reorients our imagination. Instead of seeing the world as a series of threats, as chaos, we see it as a place where God is at work. Think about the tension points, the flash points. What if those were the very places where God's trying to work? In our kids, in our friendships, the places where we have contention. What if God could be at work in the contention in our lives? This reminds us that the big battle isn't about us winning or losing, but it's about participating in God's ongoing work of redemption. That is, that God is working in people's lives. And many times where God is at work, and catch this here, where God is at work, people will fight God. So when if you have a loved one or a friend where they are just struggling with things, it could be that God is working and there's tension there that they're fighting God. Paul himself, when he is confronted by Jesus, the very first question Jesus asked Paul is, why are you fighting so hard against me? Kids, before bedtime, when they're really tired, what do? They fight. They fight it. They fight. I'm just gonna stay awake. And then finally they succumb and they're knocked out cold, right? They just totally fall asleep. What's interesting is where we're in contention in our own lives, it's most often where we're fighting what God's trying to do in loving us and shaping our soul, shaping us who we are. He's forming our imagination. And when we allow God to work in our lives, that tension will give way to a peace that passes understanding. And God molds us and shapes us to be what? To be his kids, to look like him for his glory and for our good. We go on, we see this number 5, peace empowers steadfastness. It helps us not to give up. Ephesians 6:15 says the shoes of peace that he enable us to enable standing firm. It gives us a steadfastness to be able to stand our ground. This peace that empowers steadfastness, it gives us staying power, if you will. Firm footing allows believers to endure trials without falling, not because of human strength, but because the stability that the gospel provides. That God loves me and God sent Jesus to die for me so I can be at peace with God. So no matter what trials come my way, I know that if I'm not dead, God's not done with me. And I say that carefully, but God, no matter what circumstances happen around us, and I say this so carefully because I don't want problems. I don't want conflict in my life. I want peace. But no matter the tension that we're facing, the things that are on your mind right now, the people maybe that you're in conflict with right now, God says, listen, it's going to be okay. I can say with no regrets, well, I do have regrets. The regrets I have are the times I worried needlessly. I look back over my life and the times that I fretted and I worried and frustration just consumed me and it all worked out. I wasted so much time angsting and worrying over things, and God came through. God worked things out, and time again, God proved himself faithful, even in the circumstances. Like a soldier trained to stand in the midst of chaos, the believer doesn't stumble when the storm hits because peace has prepared every step. We find then in this wrap up that peace empowers steadfastness. Peace empowers steadfastness, and this reflection for us stand in the assurance of God's peace and carry that peace wherever you go. That peace that passes understanding, let that be carried into your relationships so that you don't have to force the conversation with somebody. As you have peace, it'll be so drawing and so attractive, if you will, and so dumbfounding for other people. There's the poem "If" by Rudyard Kipling. If everyone is losing their heads, if you can keep your head when everybody around you is losing their heads and blaming it on you, if you can trust when all men don't trust, if you can have certainty and clarity when all men doubt you, it's a great poem. But the idea is that we can be at peace in ourselves and at peace with God and at peace with other people, even when emotions are contagious. If we can be able to lovingly, slightly stand our ground and push back with some peace, it can have a massive, powerful impact in the lives of people around us. A parent who is at peace can help their kids be at peace. A employee who is at peace can influence their coworkers and influence their boss to be at peace. A pastor, for me, this is a challenge for me to be at peace. Have you ever found some people everywhere they go, they stir up conflict. They are a problem looking for a place to happen. They're just constantly stirring up conflict. Why? That's just it's what lights them up. God calls us not to go around stirring up conflict. He calls us to go around being people who bring harmony and peace. In our next session, we're going to talk about the shield of faith, how to stop Satan's fiery darts. Take a few minutes and take a look at the discussion questions on the next page there. Take a look at the meditation and memory verse. And then as well, don't forget, you have the devotional for the in-between sessions to be able to unpack these principles and these truths about peace and how it can guard our hearts. It can steady our steps and help our relationships to have harmony with God. Thanks for watching.